Welcome to part 5 of my 2005 IDW Transformers Comics Continuity Retrospective. Today we're looking at Transformers Escalation, the 6-part direct follow-up to Infiltration. Escalation reunites Simon Furman and E.J. Sue to continue telling the main story of IDW's Transformers universe. It's the main story, yes, but IDW also published Stormbringer and several spotlight issues before the first issue of Escalation was published on November 29th, 2006. Those issues published during the intervening months between Infiltration number 6 and Escalation number 1 are essential for grasping the complete view of the Transformers universe Simon Furman was building from the ground up, and would tie directly into the story of Escalation in minor and major ways. With the Decepticon threat on Earth evolving in an unpredictable manner thanks to the presence of OR-13, Escalation delivers on the promise of its title by ramping up the action in almost every regard. I think the specifics of that are best discussed in the review section of the video, but before we get there, we've got some other sections to get through first, so let's not delay any further and hit the synopsis for these 6 issues. After the events of Infiltration and Stormbringer, Escalation finds Optimus Prime and Megatron assuming a more direct role in the conflict unfolding on Earth. After putting down Starscream's insurrection, Megatron gets the remaining Decepticons back on track with Phase 2 of the Decepticon Infiltration Protocol, which consists of provoking and agitating existing geopolitical tensions, stoking the flames of war while still operating covertly from the shadows. To accomplish this, the Decepticons make use of facsimiles, which seem to be essentially sleeper agent clones that have replaced key figures in leadership positions around the world. Once activated, facsimiles allow the Decepticons greater influence over world events while maintaining their anonymity. Although Megatron would not normally be present at this stage, OR-13 has changed things, making Earth a critical battleground in the ongoing Autobot-Decepticon conflict. Plus, he went to all the trouble of upgrading to an Earth form and wants to put it to good use, so he decides to hang around a little bit longer. While we see at one point Thundercracker and Skywarp conducting a bombing mission to inflame tensions in the Middle East, the bulk of this book focuses on Megatron's attempts to stoke war amongst the world's superpowers by instigating a regional conflict in the fictional former Russian-held state of Brosnia. Georgy Koska, the leader of the Brosnan separatist faction and key Decepticon facsimile, is instrumental in helping precipitate hostilities, albeit with backup from Blitzwing and Megatron himself, assuming a gun form inspired by his G1 depictions. With Earth quickly shaping up to be a significant flashpoint in the planet-spanning Autobot-Decepticon war thanks to the presence of OR-13, the Autobots would already have their mechanical hands full with the Decepticons alone, but their attention and efforts are swiftly divided by the Machination. Just as a refresher, the Machination is a secret organization buried within a corporate front known as Epsilon Holdings, owned by Abraham Dante. We last saw them in Infiltration, where they assembled a strike force led by a man known as Mr. Drake to locate and capture a Cybertronian. After tracking the Autobots to Arc-19, the Autobots' secret vessel parked on the bottom of Lake Michigan, Drake and his team formulate a somewhat convoluted plan to immobilize and detain one of the Cybertronians, a plan that is executed flawlessly when Sunstreaker and Ironhide emerge to escort human characters Verity Carlo, Hunter O'Nion, and Jimmy Pink out of the Autobot-Decepticon conflict and back to their old lives, with Ironhide carrying Verity and Jimmy, and Sunstreaker transporting Hunter. By cutting Sunstreaker off from Ironhide, and with the element of surprise on their side, the Machination is able to subdue Sunstreaker, and by the time Ironhide and his passengers reach the scene, they find nothing but a burned-out, destroyed husk of Sunstreaker's frame, leading the three to conclude that Sunstreaker and his human passenger were both killed in this mysterious ambush. Unable to recover the remains before local law enforcement arrived, the Autobots keep tabs on the confiscated wreckage, following it to a police impound in Springfield, Missouri. Jazz and Wheeljack begin to infiltrate the lot, discovering in short order that they're not the only ones after Sunstreaker's corpse, and quickly come face to face with Drake and his Machination agents. Although the Machination is able to somehow fend off Jazz and Wheeljack, which is kind of embarrassing for the Autobots, the humans don't totally get away scot-free. The Machination truck transporting the wreckage is stopped somewhat brutally by Optimus Prime. The Autobots recover Sunstreaker's remains remains only to discover that they aren't actually Sunstreaker's remains at all. It was a decoy, meaning Sunstreaker's apparent destruction was all staged because, as Prime surmises, the only way the Autobots would stop looking for their ally is if they knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was really dead. And I guess that's why the Machination tried to make the decoy vanish from the impound lot, so the Autobots wouldn't be able to ascertain that the wreckage they saw wasn't Sunstreaker. I don't know. The point is, the Autobots, as well as Verity and Jimmy, now have found a glimmer of hope that the real Sunstreaker, and Hunter by extension, might still be alive wherever they are. Not that it seems like Optimus intends to do anything about it, however. He shoots down Ironhide's attempts to volunteer to find Sunstreaker, instead trying to rein in Prowl's unruly detachment by calling in reinforcements and shifting focus purely on trying to find a solid lead on the Decepticon threat. In time, the Autobots are able to narrow down their search to Georgi Kaska and his mysterious gun. And so, a strike team consisting of Prime, Prowl, Jazz, and Wheeljack departs for Brosnia to push back against the Decepticon efforts in the region. Once in Brosnia, the Autobots split up, with Optimus making himself the bait to draw out Georgi Kaska and Megatron. Once they appear, Prowl, Wheeljack, and Jazz are to move in and secure Kaska, as the facsimile's genetic code will allow the Autobots to pinpoint all the other Decepticon facsimiles in play on Earth. The initial part of the plan works perfectly, and soon Prowl and his team are battling against Skywarp and Astrotrain to reach Kaska, while Optimus goes head-to-head with Megatron. Meanwhile, those Autobot reinforcements Prime called in arrive in Earth orbit aboard ARC-32, consisting of Hot Rod, Nightbeat, and Hardhead. Although these three are directed to sit tight until they're needed, Hot Rod says screw that, and he and Hardhead arrive in Brosnia via orbital bounce. Hot Rod has Hardhead back up Wheeljack and Jazz, while he goes after Georgi Kaska with Prowl, managing to secure the facsimile before the fake human decommissions himself by way of death by Russian military. While all of this is happening, Optimus Prime makes a valiant effort, but ultimately proves to be outmatched by the OR-13 enhanced Megatron, and appears to die after sustaining critical injuries. In reality, Optimus has essentially faked his own death in a gambit to regroup from Megatron's assault, transferring his higher functions into his trailer database, or something like that, I think. The process leads to Prime having something akin to a mystical experience, where he finds himself in the mysterious realm of infraspace, while his consciousness downloads into his trailer. Inside infraspace, Optimus encounters another entity, one that fills him with a sense of dread, a strange yet familiar presence that seems to be watching the entire universe. That presence is a mystery for another day, however, as there are more pressing concerns. Hot Rod, with the facsimile in hand, prepares for an orbital bounce back to ARC-32 when Skywarp suddenly teleports into the battlefield with Thundercracker, and the Seekers open fire right as the orbital bounce commences, injuring Hot Rod and hitting the facsimile, which is apparently enough to turn him into a pile of goo, denying the Autobots their goal of acquiring Kaska's genetic profile. Meanwhile, Prowl, Jazz, Wheeljack, and Hardhead attempt to fend off Megatron to no success, when Prime's voice materializes over Prowl's radio, communicating from infraspace, explaining how to counteract the effects of OR-13 as the Autobots did in Stormbringer, by hitting Megatron with everything they have and not letting up in order to burn out the supercharged power source. In the end, Prowl and company do enough for Optimus to restore his consciousness into his body, giving him the opportunity to land a critical strike by blasting Megatron right in the face, weakening the Decepticon leader significantly enough that he stages a retreat, transforming to gun mode and being carried off by Skywarp, leaving the Autobots alive to fight another day, but far from victorious. While the showdown in Brosnia unfolds, Jimmy and Verity, unable and unwilling to just sit by while Hunter could be out there, take matters into their own hands and begin to search for any kind of clue with the fake Sunstreaker. Jimmy is finally given something to do in that he is able to identify the type of alloy that Sunstreaker's decoy was made from, and is able to conclude that there are only a few known manufacturers. Verity makes a pitch to Ratchet that if she could just get access to ARC-19's mainframe, time, she could help point the Autobots in the right direction of where to look for clients and customers of said manufacturers. Never one to miss an opportunity to flaunt Prowl's authority, Ratchet agrees, and Verity, Jimmy, Ratchet, and Ironhide soon find themselves in Fort Wayne, Indiana, investigating a mysterious custom wheel shop, which happens to have the just barely visible name of Idea and Design Works Custom Wheels, a nod to what the IDW acronym stands for, as an aside. The wheel shop has an unusually high level of security, including systems capable of detecting the Autobots' hollow matter avatars. So that means Verity and Jimmy have to go in solo yet again, and once more find themselves in imminent danger as they discover a secret basement that appears to have been used by the Machination, and in the process triggering the security systems within the building, which are fairly extreme to say the least, with sleeping gas for an opener and a closer in the form of a self-destruct sequence. Fortunately, Ironhide and Ratchet are able to work together to extract the unconscious Jimmy and Verity before the shop explodes, but not in time for Ironhide to escape the blast. With emergency crews soon on site, Ratchet is unable to help the deactivated Ironhide and can only reflect on the total mess he's gotten himself into, with no solid fix on who abducted Sunstreaker and Hunter or where they might have been taken. The only clue they have, though one still unbeknownst to Ratchet at this point, is a card with an M on it that Verity grabbed and held onto. Hunter, as we'll see throughout Escalation, is alive, but imprisoned in a Machination building in Tampa, Florida, where he becomes an unwilling subject of medical experimentation. In one particularly horrifying moment, we see him conscious but drugged, thus unable to speak or move as a medical team preps him for surgery. This upgrade, as Abraham Dante later calls it, proves to be a successful endeavor and means that the Machination can proceed full speed ahead with their clandestine schemes. It also means that Hunter has outlived his usefulness, that is, unless he can be reconditioned to serve the Machination cause. What that cause is precisely has yet to be revealed, but we get some intriguing glimpses of how that threat is going to unfold, with a brief look at headless multiple Sunstreaker bodies, as well as hints of Dante suffering from an affliction and in need of a new lease on life, along with the Machination's mysterious Cybertronian ally, only appearing in the pages of Escalation either as a voice coming from off-panel or as a badly damaged, disembodied head, hidden in shadow and suspended by wires and cables. But the Machination isn't the only threat looming on the horizon. Skywatch, a government agency devoted to protecting Earth from Cybertronian invaders, makes its first appearance here, seizing control of the Eureka, Nevada archaeological dig site seen in Spotlight Shockwave, where a fair amount of progress has been made in unearthing Shockwave and the Dinobots. Not only that, but Skywatch is in possession of a fully functional Laserbeak and Ravage, prompting the question of where they came from and how long they've been on Earth. Skywatch's motives and activities will become more clear in future issues, but for now, they're simply another player on an increasingly crowded field, one that's about to become even more crowded as Escalation concludes with a furious Megatron trashing his carefully designed infiltration protocol by summoning Six-Shot to retaliate against the Autobots, an act that will draw not only Six-Shot to Earth, but the Reapers as well, presumably to enact their twisted sense of mercy on the planet. To say things are looking grim for the Autobots would be a bit of an understatement, but that wraps up the synopsis, so let's get into some notes of interest. Starting with OR-13, as Astrotrain is bringing Megatron up to speed on the mysterious substance in issue number 1, we learn a few things about it and Energon in this continuity, namely that the Decepticons have been living off of artificial substitutes of Energon for quite some time, making it likely that the Autobots have as well, which would mean the discovery of OR-13 would be a huge advantage, even discounting its additional powers. OR-13 appears to be a close relative to Energon, meaning Shockwave did a pretty good job getting close to the original, aside from the whole fatal flaw baked into its consumption. Also in issue number 1, we see Optimus fielding transmissions from several Autobots, with 2 connected directly to the story at hand. Ultra Magnus's transmission is taken from the end of his Spotlight issue when he arrests Swindle again, Connecting this series to Ultra Magnus' Spotlight issue is pretty sneaky, as it provides a lot of clues to the identity of the Machination's benefactor, going so far as to include a near-identical complex to the one Zarek used on Nebulos. Guess Scorponok's a big fan of fountains or something. The other important transmission is from Jetfire, and he's passing along new information gleaned from Bludgeon's archives, a task Jetfire undertook after the crisis from Thunderwing had been averted in Stormbringer. The information he relays to Optimus shows Bludgeon had records of both Shockwave and Soundwave being on Earth, teasing the Spotlight issues for each character. Issue number 2 of Escalation opens and closes with Senator Holt, a character who, all things considered, ends up being of little importance in the continuity, but is set up in the pages of Escalation as potentially being a much bigger deal. We see him being targeted by Runabout during a flashback sequence 9 months ago where he's having a conversation with a general who at this point is likely to be a Decepticon facsimile, as Verity discovered his corpse in the bunker during Infiltration. We see Holt again at the end of the issue during a news report, indicating that this possible Decepticon asset is considering a presidential bid. We never find out definitively if he's a facsimile or not, but it seems likely that he was replaced in the same manner as the general. But even if he wasn't, the opening shows that he's clearly being influenced by Decepticon facsimiles. Either way, we get a sense for how deeply the Decepticons had infiltrated the political infrastructure of Earth and what shape their plans were taking to control and destabilize the nations of the world. The fictional state of Brosnia is first introduced here in the pages of Escalation. Brosnia obviously plays a major role in the conflict in this issue, but will continue to be important, though in some unexpected ways, and ways that were certainly not considered during the publishing of this particular series. In Phase 3, during the Revolutionaries miniseries, John Barber would use Brosnia as a vital setting in his retcons involving the Talisman. Similarly, this is the first usage of infraspace, the limbo state between life and death that would also become significant during Barber's stories in Phase 3, though the visual depiction of infraspace will change pretty drastically in later instances. Hardhead makes his first appearance in the IDW continuity here. G1 Hardhead was introduced to the Transformers toy line in 1987 as an Autobot headmaster alongside Chrome Dome, Brainstorm, Highbrow, and Fortress Maximus. Like Nightbeat, however, Hardhead is not a headmaster in the IDW continuity, as that subgroup technically doesn't exist yet. I think it's kind of crazy that this line is so iconic and memorable, but Ironhide is interrupted after saying "but Prime" in the early part of issue number 2, a direct reference to the 1986 animated movie where Ironhide started to protest being sent to Autobot City, which you can't really blame him considering that whole trip really didn't end well for him. In the same conversation, the book fills out the other half of the Robots in Disguise tagline that was cleverly inserted into Infiltration. In Escalation, when talking about Sunstreaker's capture, Prime says, "It's only a matter of time before the humans realize he's somewhat more than meets the eye." Gearing up for the release of the live-action Transformers movie in summer of 2007, IDW began running promotional material for their prequel tie-in comic, written by Simon Furman and Chris Ryle, and penciled by Don Figueroa. I haven't read it beyond the preview that was included in one of the issues of Escalation, but I hope to get around to it someday. It's kind of interesting to see it nowadays. Really helps place Escalation in a very specific time of the franchise before things popped off in a fairly big way. Let's move on to the review and analysis section and really dig deeper into this series. As I've said before, Escalation delivers on its namesake in a number of ways. In a fairly short amount of time, the IDW continuity shot past the slow burn days of Infiltration, settling quite naturally into being a full-blown universe with numerous moving parts in the form of an expanding roster of characters and multiple plot threads. After reading Escalation, the vision for this continuity becomes a lot more clear. Everything from the various miniseries to the spotlight issues form the complete picture of the world Furman was building, with each entry being deeply connected and in service to that big picture. Everything we've looked at previously on the channel comes back or plays into Escalation in some way, with the exception of Hearts of Steel, of course, as it was, at this time, still considered to be set in a separate continuity. But Escalation is also a satisfying read in its own right. It's one of the handful of series I reach for when I just want to read a great Transformers story, but I don't feel like committing to the entirety of a continuity. So what is it that makes Escalation such an enjoyable read for me, one that I keep coming back to? Well, there are a few things. More Transformers directly involved is certainly a part of it. Escalation continues with the tried and and true early G1 cast for the most part, but throws a few curveballs like Hot Rod and Nightbeat, fresh from their appearances in their respective spotlight issues. But the biggest surprise addition to the cast is Hardhead. And I have to say that I love Hardhead, but that love is a real chicken and the egg situation here. Did I always like the character as much as I do, or did the IDW continuity make me like him more? Leaning towards the latter, although I have to say I always liked his color scheme in alt mode. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the character selection is on point with Escalation, and it feels like they're all given a decent amount of stuff to do, with the exception of Nightbeat, but his time will come soon enough. We get some really nice moments with Ironhide throughout this book. He sort of takes a much more prominent role, while the other Vanbro, Ratchet, who, while still around and important to the story, gets less time in the spotlight compared to Infiltration. And you know, it's funny, I feel like my favorite Ironhide moments in this book all happen when the character is in alt mode, like when he realizes he and Sunstreaker have fallen into a trap in issue number 1 and just starts ramming his way out of the situation. I don't know, there's just something about the degree of intensity and decisiveness that Furman gave to Ironhide here that I find really enjoyable. He's direct, rough, and no nonsense, but he's also willing to stick his neck out to do the right thing. I think the perfect encapsulation of his character is in issue number 5 and number 6, where Ironhide decides the time for delicacy and discreet action has passed, crashing into the wheel shop with this really nice blue-tinged panel before ramming through the entire shop to get to Verity and Jimmy, which leads to the other part of his personality, the heroic self-sacrificing part, where he refuses to heed Ratchet's warnings and get to a safer distance. Also, he can be sure to rescue Verity and Jimmy. And while he is instrumental in saving the humans, it comes at the cost of getting caught in the blast himself. Speaking of the human characters, while they may be less prevalent compared to Infiltration, they still have a significant part to play in Escalation, driving the subplot of the rogue Autobots looking for Sunstreaker and Hunter, and I enjoy it quite a bit. It does feel somewhat similar to their big outing in Infiltration, where they explored the Nebraska bunker on their own while the Autobots had to wait outside, but it feels different enough, to me anyway, thanks to the involvement of the Machination and their various phony operations, which sort of pushes the plot more towards thriller or spy territory, although it was always kind of in that realm, just feels more so here in Escalation. And this whole thread is maybe less striking than what's happening in Brosnia, but it's definitely important for setting up future stories, and I like that it doesn't really go well for our heroes. It's not a smashing success by any metric. Furman is pretty good at finding potential in character failure and extracting ways of driving a story from situations that end poorly for the heroes, and Escalation has quite a bit of that. No victory in this series is untarnished by setbacks or loss, and I think that makes for some pretty interesting material. Moving on, there's a fairly big component to what makes Escalation great that we need to talk about, and that's the fight between Optimus and Megatron in issue number 5. This is the first time the two came to blows in the publishing history of the IDW 05 continuity, and it does not disappoint. Almost half of the issue's 22 pages are dedicated to this fight, depending on if you want to count the stuff towards the end with Roller or not. So yeah, it's a lengthy battle, and a lot of space is devoted to the fight choreography, if you will. And Sue does an amazing job here, essentially creating the comic book equivalent of the fight scene between Prime and Megatron early on in the 1986 animated movie. That scene was also a pretty intricate, highly choreographed one-on-one combat scene between the two faction leaders, and it's probably one of the most memorable fight scenes from the entirety of G1 in my opinion, so it seems like an obvious point of reference for Escalation number 5. There are a few specific callbacks to the 86 movie, like Megatron losing his cannon and Optimus pulling his signature two-handed punch move, but the vast majority of the action here is new, as far as I can tell anyway, so it's mostly just the epic feel to the fight that reminds me of the animated movie, if that makes sense. And for this many panels, with this much combat, it all reads remarkably clear. There's never a point where I read this issue and become confused about what the characters are doing. Has anybody else ever experienced that? You know, sometimes when you have to stop reading and go over a panel or a page to make sense of what just happened. That happens to me sometimes when the action is unclear or hard to decipher, and maybe that's just me, but it's not a problem at all here, even when traditional panel layouts are dispensed with for more fractured or asymmetrical layouts, which, by the way, enhance the ferocity and intensity of the shots Sue decides decided to use here, in my opinion, adding more of a heightened sense of speed and motion as a result. The action is dynamic and natural, and the framing for each shot is just really well executed, with a ton of variety in terms of quote-unquote camera placement. So yeah, these sequences look great and are fun to read, but that's not all there is to this fight. While the movement and action is evocative of the animated movie, the tone and banter seems, to me anyway, to be less of the epic and dramatic stuff found in the '86 movie and more in line with the characters' battle atop Sherman Dam in the second episode of the Sunbow cartoon. There, we saw an almost sassy side of Optimus Prime with some straight-up trash talking with his whole "you're old, Megatron, yesterday's model ready for the scrap heap" bit, and I feel like there's a similar kind of tone and energy underlying the fight in Escalation. Not exact, but similar. I mean, Prime even interrupts Megatron's villainous posturing with the unceremonious splat of a snowball to the face and a quip about the power of Ore 13 only loosening Megatron's vocal routers, the Transformers equivalent of talking too much, I assume. I know for me, the '86 movie fight and the Sherman Dam fight are the most iconic clashes between Optimus Prime and Megatron, so I think it's cool that the fight in Escalation reminds me of both smushed together. Another reason why this series is a standout for me is most likely down to the ambiance. I think this book is a perfect example of the script, line art, and coloring working in tandem to produce a very atmospheric and deeply immersive reading experience. I think that's bound to be a highly subjective thing, but I'll try to explain why I think the book is successful in that regard. And I think it comes down to this. When I'm reading something, sometimes I let my imagination run wild in terms of setting the scene, especially when whatever I'm reading does a really good job of establishing a location. That can really fire up my imagination and get me thinking what it would be like to be in that space. Lighting, temperature, sounds in the environment, and so forth. Some books are better than others at engaging my imagination in that way, and Escalation is certainly one of them. And I think it enhances the overall experience for me. Again, I think it's the creative teams working really well together that makes this happen, fusing all the different elements of the story into a compelling whole, and I think it's apparent from the first issue. This page in particular, with a fairly economical amount of dialogue, allowing us to sit in this kind of quiet, calm before the storm moment with cars whizzing by on the interstate, while the crestfallen human cast of characters reflect on returning to their normal lives. That's a moment that's always stood out to me, so I wanted to draw attention to it, but there are definitely better examples of the effect I'm getting at here with the sense of scene and location, the chilly stillness of Bosnia, the late-night excursions to the police impound and the IDW wheel shop. These are all the bigger examples of what I'm talking about with the book establishing a sense of immersion into a scene. There's also the multiple scenes set inside the Autobot and Decepticon bases, with this one in particular being a highlight for me, where Optimus and Prowl are analyzing intel from Bosnia, with both Autobots bathed in blue light, surrounded by monitors and machines, which just gets me thinking about the sound of all those devices humming, beeping, and whirring. Maybe this is all just me and my experience, but the atmosphere is most definitely a part of the book that I really enjoy and think it pulls off really well. But there are certainly a few somewhat silly things in Escalation as well, and while we're looking at these pages, we might as well start with this one. I really get a kick out of how Prowl shows Optimus a satellite image of Casca firing Megatron with this impossibly huge blast, but the thing that really clinches it for Optimus in terms of being a Decepticon action is when Prowl puts something called a resonance overlay over the image. Like, I feel like that Casca dude should have been dead in so many different ways from a blast of that size. I mean, that fact alone, maybe it should have been obvious without a resonance overlay that something weird was going on here. And this might have been a simple disconnect between what Furman and Sue were each envisioning for this moment, but the end result is pretty funny. And the other kind of silly thing is the convoluted machination scheme to abduct a Transformer, specifically with the Sunstreaker decoy. We only see the one truck housing the decoy, and they had no way of knowing which Transformer would come out of the arc. So did the machination have 7 decoys for each one of the Autobots stationed on Earth ready to go in 7 separate trucks? Or did they just get extremely lucky? That the machination are as prepared and successful as they are seems fairly implausible on the surface, but I suppose it's mitigated somewhat by the fact that they had Cybertronian help. Another thing that I'd put in the silly column is that Prowl's detachment is a complete mess. We've got Autobots going rogue, going over the heads of both Prowl and Prime, taking matters into their own hands, and Prowl's attempts to get his unit under control are a total joke. His disciplinary measures don't seem to mean a thing, as evidenced by Ratchet and Ironhide, two characters who have recently received a dressing down from Prowl, and who show no hesitation in breaking protocol again at the first available opportunity. You know, maybe that's why Prowl turns into such a jerk later on in the continuity. Nobody takes him seriously, and everybody undermines his authority every chance they get. Even Hot Rod gets in on the action towards the end of the book, telling Prowl to get over himself. There's also one more instance of silliness that feels fairly intentional in issue number 4, where Captain Todorov is observing the fight between the Autobots and Decepticons. He says, "We appear to have an American F-22 Raptor being shot at by some kind of rally vehicle, and a police patrol car, also American, under attack from a space shuttle." This is a humorous moment, but I can't help but wonder if there was a little bit of fun being had in pointing out how bonkers the underlying concept of the brand really is, especially to the uninitiated or someone looking in from the outside. I don't know, maybe not, but it was amusing nonetheless. But while there are a few silly things like the ones that I've covered throughout Escalation, they don't really detract from the experience. In fact, I think they all make the series more fun in a way. If you saw my video on Infiltration, then you know I'm a big fan of E.J. Sue's artwork. He's definitely one of my favorite Transformers artists, and I would say that his work continues to be strong here. Many of the things I said about his artwork for Infiltration carry over here. Framing, anatomy, dynamic action are all on point, and there are tons of little mechanical touches on his Transformers that contribute to the G1 but modernized identity of the book. Seeing how there's more focus on Transformers this time around, that means we get more action with them, and a part of Sue's work here that I appreciate is how he handles transformations. From the multi-figure approach, showing characters in a kind of before and after state with a mid-transformation state in between, to the strategic use of motion lines to insinuate a quick change between modes, to simply showing characters mid-transformation in a panel. It feels like there's a good amount of variety in how Sue depicts the signature ability and primary selling point of these characters. And depicting that kind of motion in the medium of comics is no small feat, so I think Sue deserves some recognition for what he accomplishes here. There's also something that I consider to be something unique to Sue in some of his transformations, where a character transforms and grabs their gun out of the air. We saw this trick in Infiltration, so it's nice to see it again early on with Jazz in issue number 2, but the coolest example comes from one of my favorite pages in Escalation, this one from issue number 5, where Optimus transforms to open fire on Megatron. Sue spreads this out across 2 panels, one for the transformation sequence, and then another for Prime grabbing and aiming his iconic ion blaster. In the Infiltration video, I pointed out how Sue would sometimes space out actions across several panels, but here we see the opposite, where he packs in a ton of action into only a couple of panels. There's so much variety in his art throughout his tenure on this series, and it's an approach that I really appreciate. There are also a few little world-building touches in the script that I like. The concept of mass displacement is introduced with the caveat that it requires a large amount of energy to pull off, making it rare, but apparently enticing. Of all the things he could do, Megatron chooses to use the power of Or-13 to reformat his alt mode into a human-sized gun, which makes it seem like something he would do for fun or for the thrill of it or something. In a way, I feel like this little detail helps set the stage for transformations being something of an exhilaration to Cybertronians, or characters who get a high off of changing shape, like Tarn in Phase 2, who's said to be addicted to transforming to the extent that he burns through T-cogs like nobody's business. The other thing worth noting here is Prime's trailer. Obviously, it and the roller drone can serve as additional firepower or backup for Optimus, but it also literally saves his life in Escalation, allowing him to fake his own death so Megatron will turn his attention elsewhere. He does this by apparently uploading his consciousness into his trailer or something. I don't really get the specifics of it, but it's a cool little detail that's the kind of thing you'd normally expect to see in cyberpunk fiction. So it's fun to see something wild and inventive like that in a Transformers story. But that's all I've got on Escalation, so it's time for me to sign off. Leave me a comment about your thoughts on Escalation or the video. Thank you for watching this. Make sure to hit the thumbs up button if you liked what you saw. Hit the subscribe button. Check out my playlist to see my other IDW retrospective videos. And if you're curious about the latest comics continuity from Skybound, check out my videos on that series as well. Thanks again. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Take care.